is on the elements of form. So we need to have a vocabulary for the building blocks that we're going to be using to create a work of art or a design. And so once we've got that kind of common vocabulary, then we can go on to how we're applying it. So these are kind of your basic terms that we're going to use to kind of make up an image, and we'll then talk about the application in the next set of slides. So we're going to go from line to shape to form, and then all of those exist within space. And then we're going to talk about color and texture. So these slides are specifically going to focus on the definitions, and we're going to go over the examples more in class. So a line is a mark with a greater length than width. So we can think about this as being very one-dimensional, talking about something more than a point, but we're not talking about something that has area. Lines can be horizontal, vertical, or diagonal. We can have straight lines, we can have curved lines. Now, lines can be thick or thin, but we're talking about just the single dimension of the line. There are certain feelings that we associate with different marks on the page, and it's good to keep these in mind when you are using them. Horizontal lines suggest rest or repose, kind of a feeling of lying down. Because objects parallel to the earth, we consider them to be at rest. Similarly, we lie down at the end of the day to fall asleep. Vertical lines often communicate height because they're perpendicular to the earth, so we think of them as going up towards the sky. And if we use horizontal and vertical lines together, we think about stability and solidity. So you think about right angles, you think about if you used two horizontal and two vertical lines, then you would put those together and you'd form a square. Now we're not doing that yet because we're still just staying with the one-dimensional line though. Now diagonal lines, they convey a feeling of movement. Things that are diagonal are often unstable. They're neither vertical nor horizontal. They're neither heading up towards the sky nor fully at rest. They're either about to fall or they're already in motion. Now, curved lines can convey energy. If you're doing soft and shallow curves, think about the human body. They have a pleasing or sensual quality, and you can often use these to have a softening effect on composition. Again, if it's a bigger curve, there's more energy that's going to be involved, the less it's going away from an organic form. We'll talk more about organic forms in coming slides. Example number 1. And here we are transitioning from line into shape. Shape is a closed line. It can be filled or it may not be filled. Shape is usually, although not always, defined by line, which provides its contour. So now we're going from one dimension to two dimensions. We're going from having those two horizontal and two vertical lines into actually making a square. So we can have geometric shapes or we can have organic shapes that are freeform or natural. Shapes are going to be flat. So again, we're thinking them in 2-dimension. We have length and width. We are not in 3 dimensions yet. Three dimensions is form. And so this is where the vocabulary is very important. We're going from shape into form. Form has length, width, and depth. So we're thinking balls, we're thinking cylinders, we're thinking boxes rather than squares, and pyramids instead of triangles. Now, often we're going to mimic a 3D shape in 2 dimensions if you're doing a drawing or an illustration. So in that case, we're combining shapes in order to mimic form. An example is a sculptured horse versus a illustrated horse that we have illustrated in a manner as which to mimic 3-dimensionality. You cannot actually touch the horse on the right. It would be a flat piece of paper. If you could touch the horse on the left, it would be a fully formed model of a horse. Obviously, you can't touch either of them because both of them are depictions on this slide. So, even more meta. Again, for both shape and form, we can have geometric shapes, geometric forms, and organic shapes or organic forms. And what I mean by that is geometric shapes are things like you see repeated here in this commode, where we have the squares that look a bit like cubes being repeated. We have the circles being repeated. Anything that you could represent with a mathematical equation, that's what we're talking about, geometric shapes. Rectangles, squares, triangles, cubes, cylinders, spheres, dodecahedrons, anything like that. But this particular example also has some organic lines if you look at things like the kind of clawfoot at the bottom. Organic forms and shapes are going to be things that we see in nature, things that aren't quite so regimented that you could easily represent them with a mathematical formula. They're things like the curve between your thumb and your first finger, or the curve of a leaf or a berry. And yes, a berry is sort of a sphere, but it's not perfect. It has some irregularities, and that's what makes it real and living. Now, space is the area between and around the objects. In two-dimensional work, so that is work that's on a printed page that isn't sculptural, that isn't three-dimensional, we're often talking about the picture plane. So we're often talking about the space within the image rather than it actually coming out from the page and being physical. But if we are talking about a sculpture, then we are literally talking about the space around the physical form. So if we're talking in 2 dimensions, then we're thinking about the feeling of depth. If we're talking about form, then we've got real space in a 3-dimensional area. In visual art, if we are creating the feeling of illusion of depth, then we're going to call it space. So if we are recreating form using shapes in a 2-dimensional space, we'll talk about space as that mimicking of actual depth. So for an example here, there's the feeling of depth that's created by the perspective in this image. Clearly, this image does not actually go anywhere. It's still on a 2-dimensional plane. A really important aspect of space when we're talking about design in particular, more than say illustration or painting, is the use of positive and negative space. So we've got the space that's occupied by the objects. Now that's positive space. But there's the space around it as well, and we really should consider this. And this is going to be of importance, especially the 2 projects you're going to work on where this will come really into play is when you're working with your emotive text and when you're working on your icons. So you need to think about the kind of relationship between the object and the space that the object's sitting on. And the space that it's sitting on is that negative space. And negative space has a shape. You see this used by logos all the time and played with, and oftentimes most clever logos will have things hidden in their negative space that really reinforce the ideas. And you can use this again when you're trying to create emotion with your text, or if you're trying to create icons that are really strong. Think about the whole space, not just the form, but the blank space around it. Now there's 2 parts to color that you'll need to understand. I think we all understand that color is that light that's reflected off of objects that we've decided has a specific tone to it. But when we're using color in design, we're going to need to talk about it. There's kind of 2 key things that we're going to need to talk about. Now, one is how we're forming the color. We're going to get later into the differences between print and screen, but this is a little primer. When we're talking about color, we have additive color, so that's screen color, where when you put all the colors together, they make white. So when you're working on a screen, if you looked really, really, really close at your screen, you would see that every single pixel is actually made up of a red, a blue, and a green diode. When all of them are on, you'll see white. When all of them are off, you'll see black. So all the colors together create white. There's also a subtractive color system, and that's what happens in print. So that's when you take ink or pigment and you put them together, and when you put them all together, they make black. So visually, you've got a subtractive color system. Most common one we use is CMYK, where you have cyan, magenta, and yellow. And when you put them together, well, that actually make kind of a muddy brown. So we also use black. And that's what we use in print. Whereas additive, or on the screen, red, green, and blue add up to make white. Now, one of the things you might notice is that the magenta over on CMYK is a bit darker than the kind of magenta color made by putting red and blue together. And you'll be able to get much brighter colors on screen than you are in print. And so this is really important when you are working back and forth between print and screen and you want things to match. Again, you can see it with the yellow and the bright, bright blue that's on the RGB isn't quite the same as the cyan. The other thing, when I'm talking about the brightness, is we have a unified way, or more or less unified way, of talking about the characteristics of the color. So I was finding it really hard to not talk about color without saying hue, but we think that the sky is blue and we think the grass is green. Now that's going to be the hue of the color. So whatever it is, whatever wavelength you get when you bounce light off of the object, that's your hue. Now, value is how light or dark that hue is. And the last one is intensity, or it's sometimes called saturation. If we're using an Adobe product, you'll see HSV, and that's hue, saturation, and value. Other times you'll see hue, value, and intensity. Intensity and saturation are exactly the same thing. And that's just how bright or dull the color is. And that's a little bit easier to see here in the hue, saturation, and value image, where you can see multiple colors there, multiple hues. We've got a whole rainbow. And then if you pick out a red, you can have a really saturated red, or you can desaturate it. And when you desaturate any color, it's going to go into a black, white, or gray scale. So that's the other reason why if you were going to try to make a black and white photograph, you would desaturate it. And the value oftentimes comes down to contrast. How black or how white is that going to end up being? The last element of form I want to talk about is texture. And that is the surface quality that can be felt, or if it's in 2 dimensions, we can see it and we can kind of imply a feeling out of it. Again, this is where the kind of emotional part of your brain comes in. So textures can be rough or smooth, they can be soft or hard. And when I see about the emotional side, or the kind of implication, some of the times, you know, you could see a drawing of a porcupine and you know that it's sharp, but the paper's smooth, so it's not actually prickly. So surface texture is if you've got that, you get the sculpture of the horse, and so that bronze is very smooth to the touch. But the depiction of the tail is wild, and so the depicted texture is kind of crazy. And again, you've got the depicted texture of this porcupine being prickly and sharp, but if you touch your screen, it should be smooth, I hope.